So every single year, hundreds of thousands of students all across Illinois sit down to take the Illinois Assessment of Readiness, the IAR. But have you ever stopped to wonder where that test actually comes from? I mean, who builds it? How on earth is it scored? Well, in this explainer, we're going to pull back the curtain on that whole process. We're going to demystify how this massive statewide test gets made. Let's jump in.
Just to give you a sense of the scale we're talking about, look at this number. That's how many students in just 1 year took the English language arts part of the IAR. That's nearly 800,000 tests. Each one has to be created, given out, and then scored in a way that's both accurate and fair. The logistics behind this are just incredible.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll cover the basics. What is this test even for? Then we'll dive into the really cool how it's made part. We'll follow the journey from a student's answer all the way to their final score. We'll tackle that huge question of fairness, and then finally, we'll see how those results we all look at are actually decided.
All right, first things first. Before we get into all the nuts and bolts, we've got to understand the fundamental reason this test exists in the first place. What's the why?
So, at its heart, the IAR isn't just another test. It's a very specific tool, and it's designed to measure just one thing: how well are students grasping the material that's laid out in the Illinois Learning Standards. You can think of it as a single, consistent measuring stick that's used for every student from 3rd to 8th grade. It gives everyone a common snapshot of how things are going, from one school district to the next.
Okay, now for the really fascinating part, the architecture of the test itself. How in the world do you build a test for over 700,000 students that's consistent, fair, and accurate year after year? Well, it all starts with a recipe.
The absolute key to the whole operation is something called a test blueprint. And honestly, the best way to think about it is like a recipe for a cake. You need very specific amounts of flour, sugar, eggs, all that stuff to get the same cake every time. The blueprint does the exact same thing for the test. It spells out the precise mix of topics to make sure every single student is getting a comparable test.
And what's so cool is that this isn't just an idea. We can see a real blueprint right here. This one's for 8th grade math, and as you can see, it is not a random collection of math problems. A full 39% of the points have to come from what they call major content, and another 23% has to be about applying math to solve real-world problems. Every single 8th grade math test is built to these exact specs.
Now this shows the journey of just a single test question. It's wild. A question doesn't just get written and then pop up on the test. No way. After experts draft it, it goes through round after round of reviews. And here's the most important part. Illinois educators, we're talking actual teachers and principals from the state, are deeply involved. They check the questions for accuracy and, just as important, for any potential bias, to make sure they're fair for every student group, all before they're ever even tried out with real students. Okay, so the test is built, students have taken it. Now what? Let's follow the answers and see how millions of them get turned into a final score.
So a student's answer can basically go down one of two paths. For multiple choice questions, or those tech-enhanced ones where you drag and drop something, those get scored by a machine instantly. It's super fast, super consistent. But for the constructed response items, where a student has to write out an essay or show their work on a tough math problem, that goes to a human scorer. And these aren't just random people. They're trained pros who have to pass some really tough tests to prove they can score consistently.
All right, here's something that might surprise you. Most of the essays written for the English language arts test are actually graded by an AI. Yeah, the official name for it is the Intelligent Essay Assessor. But, and this is a really big but, it's not just a robot running wild. To make sure the AI is always on track, 10% of all the essays it grades are also scored by a human, just to constantly check that the machine is getting it right.
And for the questions that are scored only by humans, there are so many layers of quality control. Like we see here, at least 10% of answers get scored by a second person, working completely on their own. Supervisors also do this thing called backreading to make sure a scorer isn't slowly, drifting away from the standards. And my favorite part, they actually sneak in hidden pre-scored answers just to see if the scorers are grading them correctly. It's a constant test for the testers.
So we've built the test, we scored it, but this all leads up to what is probably the most important question of all. With all these moving parts, how do we actually know the test is fair and reliable? Let's look at the proof.
This right here is the big question. It's the whole reason they do all this complex analysis that fills up these technical reports. I mean, it's one thing to make a test. It's a completely different thing to prove that it's a good test.
To really get the proof, we need to understand two key ideas, reliability and validity. Let's use a simple analogy. Think about your bathroom scale. Reliability is just consistency. If you step on it 3 times in a row and get the same weight, hey, it's reliable. Validity, though, is about accuracy. Does that reliable scale actually measure your weight, or is it off by 10 pounds? A valid test has to measure what it claims to be measuring. The IAR has to be both.
So how do they check for fairness? Well, one of their most powerful tools is a statistical analysis with a fancy name, differential item functioning, or diff. What this process does is basically hunt through the data for any question that turns out to be way harder for one group of students, like girls versus boys, for example, than for another group, even when both groups have the exact same overall knowledge level. If a question gets flagged, it goes back to a committee of educators to figure out why and decide if it needs to be thrown out. Okay, I know this graph looks a little intense, but what it shows is actually really smart. It's called a test information function curve. All you need to know is this: the higher that curve is, the more precise the test is for students at that skill level. And notice where the peak is? It's right in the middle. The test is literally engineered to give the clearest, most reliable information about students who are performing right around the state average, because that's the group where it's most critical to know if they're on track.
All right, so we've got a well-built, fairly scored, and statistically solid test. We're on the home stretch. Let's connect all this technical stuff back to the score report that parents, teachers, and students actually see. What's the so what?
Those performance levels, meets expectations, exceeds expectations, they aren't just pulled out of thin air. They're determined by a very formal process called standard setting. Basically, they bring in panels of Illinois educators from K-12 and even higher ed. These experts go through the test, question by question, and use their professional judgment to decide what a student on the borderline of each level should be able to do. And the recommendations are what create the cut scores for those 5 levels. And this is what that whole process leads to. This table shows the final score ranges for 8th grade math. That process with the educators is what determines that a score of 749 lands you in level 3, but just one more point, 750, bumps you across the line into level 4, or proficient. Every single score has a specific meaning because of all the detailed work that came before it.
So if you take one thing away from all of this, let it be this. That single number on an IAR score report is really the tip of an enormous iceberg. It's the final product of a huge multi-year effort by thousands of people, from statisticians and item writers to Illinois teachers, all working to build one fair, accurate snapshot of student learning.
And that leaves us with one last really important question to think about. We've just seen the incredible architecture that goes into producing this one single data point. So the challenge for all of us, for parents, for teachers, for students, is to figure out how we can best use this carefully built snapshot not as the end of the story, but as the beginning of a conversation to support a student's entire journey.